What's up, everyone? Sorry about some technical difficulties there. We've been trying to get things moving, but we finally have it. We have Brian here. Brian, thank you so much for joining. For those that have joined, just some quick housekeeping. On the right-hand side, you have an engage button. If you click the engage, it will bring you to the chat. On the chat, ask your questions, whatever you want to do. If there's quick Q&A, there's a Q&A section. So feel free to drop everything there. And we're going to make this hopefully as interactive as possible. So if you do have those questions, make sure to ask them. And what's up, Kyle? Good to see you. And then, yeah, we'll just kind of, Brian, I'll let you introduce yourself. I'll let you pull up your slides and everything and get things going.
Yeah, sounds good. Thanks for having me. Really appreciate it. Glad to be here. Hopefully we're going to give some good learning and some good stuff today. The basic gist on me is I've been helping companies build communities for like 20 some odd years, like back to the 90s. So I've helped, I've worked at community platform vendors. I have worked at companies building communities. And these days I'm on the consulting side, sort of helping people, which is pretty topical actually for today's conversation, because I'm going to talk a little bit about how I think about structuring strategy and like kind of a foundational, what are the elements of success of any given, community strategy and that sort of thing. So we're going to walk you through a bunch of different things here. Let me go ahead and share my screen. So we'll get that coming through, and we'll do this. Just make sure I get the right one here, as always. All right. So it's not going to let me.
It's not going to let me.
All right, let's do this. We'll do Chrome tab. There we go. So that should be coming through. Are you seeing my slides, Nick, there?
Yeah, perfect.
Very cool. So we're going to talk about foundations. We already talked about me, so I'll skip all the about Brian stuff. Let's get right to the stuff here. Let's talk about objectives of the session today. First and foremost, I'm going to define community, just because we hear this word a lot, right? It's kind of thrown around a lot. It's applied to a lot of different things. I'm not going to argue, every single bit of that, but I'm going to give you what I think the definition is, just so we can level set before we go to strategy, because I think, your strategy could be very different, right? Depending on how you sort of define this thing. We're going to talk about why community is important. Why should I even care, right? Like, why are we here? Why are we talking about this? Why should I think about it in my business? I'll drive that home with a couple of examples. We're going to explore the common components of strategy, at least as I see them, and how I build community strategies. Again, this is sort of we have an hour and it's foundational, right? So I'm going to try to give you as much as I can, but it's certainly not as if we're going to build one today. It's more about just sort of helping you understand how to structure it, how to think about it. When a lot of people talk about strategy, what they really mean is like pretty slides. I'll teach you how to make some pretty slides, but I also, when I think about strategy, I think of both pretty slides and how do we actually operationalize this, right? How do we take it from big ideas on the screen to, okay, here's what we got to do today. Here's what we got to do tomorrow. Here's what we're doing 7 months from now. So we'll talk a little bit about that at a high level. And then last but not least, I would be remiss if I came to talk about strategy and didn't talk about how you're going to actually know if it's working or, what to measure or how to measure it, how to think about it. So, we're going to talk a little bit about those things. Again, I can't dive super deep in all of them, but I think by the time we get done here today, you'll have a pretty good sense of, all of these things as a starting point. So that's our objectives. Let's go ahead and dive in. And I can't see the chat here. So Nick, or, if you have good questions that are coming in along the way, feel free to let me know.
Absolutely.
So defining community, look, I made a post about this the other day. What I'll say about it is I think we've kind of overbaked this whole thing a lot over the years. I think we've made up a bunch of really complicated, really like semantic, arguments about community. And I kind of want to bring us back to the beginning here and just make it something elemental. Let's forget about technology. let's forget about volume. Let's forget about, some of the squabbles of the past of community and sort of just break it down in a really elemental way, right? So there's sort of three key things here. Number one, what is a community? It's a group of people, right? They're all they have similar interests. They're trying to solve problems. Trying to use a piece of software. They're using a product. Like they have interests in a, certain type of car, like, or what, like, it doesn't matter, whatever it is, it's a group of people that have some common like reason to come together. Right. The second piece here is they're coming together in what I call a shared experience. And when I say shared experience, I just simply mean that they're there together and they're helping each other and they're experiencing this in ways that they otherwise would not if they weren't together, right? So kind of the basic definition there. It's the opposite of an individual experience, right? And last but not least, they're trying to better themselves or they're trying to better each other or help each other. This is important because you'll often see communities that are really what I call a room full of mercenaries, which is basically just to say, you see these communities pop up like on Facebook and stuff, right? It's like, join our community of 100,000 entrepreneurs and get in here. And then like you go in there and all it is people just like hawking their own stuff, right? And no one's really interested in helping each other or having an experience or like building trust or relationships or connections or any of these things that we talk about around community. And so I think that's sort of a key bit here is like, are people just there for themselves or are they actually there to kind of help each other? So I think if you think about these three things as, sort of the definition, that might help you understand like what a community is, but also what you might want to build, right? Like, how do I approach this? How do I think about it? What are the core components of something that's a good community? I think this captures that fairly well. Okay. So, why though, right? Great. Sounds good, Brian. Like, awesome. But like, why do I care about this? If I'm a founder of a company or I'm running a business or, I want to start a community, why do I care, right? Why would I do this? I'll talk through a few different things. Number one, community has a lot of applicability across pretty much any business type. Depending on your goals, right, it can help you do key business things and help you sort of reach your business outcomes. So for a lot of businesses, that's like, hey, we need to lower our costs for support, right? We're spending too much money trying to support our customers. Can we do that in a more scalable way, perhaps, or a more efficient way? In other cases, people say, well, we're doing community because it's a go-to-market technique, right? And we want to drive more leads or drive more revenue or drive upsells or retain people, those kinds of things. Or it might also just be, and I think this happens if you build community really well at any company, actually helps us just scale, right? If you do community right, you should be able to kind of build something that you otherwise wouldn't have been able to with whatever your current headcount is or budget. It's highly scalable, highly efficient. And so that's, why a lot of people like community and why it's become a pretty important kind of go-to-market, factor for a lot of companies. Number two, you can build a moat with a better experience, right? So one thing that we commonly hear across many businesses, many, industries, many verticals, all those things is, it's crowded, right? It's a crowded space. Like whatever your company does, there's probably 10 other companies that do something very similar. They have a similar product, similar service. So the question becomes, well, how are we going to differentiate ourselves? And why would people choose us? And why would they stay with us rather than go to the other guys? Maybe it's cheaper, why would they continue paying our thing when they can cut costs and go somewhere else? Oftentimes it's because you've built a better experience and you do that through community and you've built relationships with them. And what you'll find is that customers often will advocate for, hey, we want to stay with these folks because we really like them. They, we're part of this community. We get a lot of value out of that. I have seen and witnessed over the years win-loss reports from our friends in sales and the revenue org, where people literally said this when they either bought brand new or they renewed, where they would say, hey, look, we could have gone to any of your competitors. You all do the same thing, but we stayed with you for the expertise and the community and the events and the knowledge and all of the sort of tangential success that I'm getting through community. So it can be a really huge way to sort of build a moat and own a space, even if your product is not, leagues ahead of the other guys or whatever. Or even if it is, then you build an even bigger moat. So it's applicable either way. Engagement, satisfaction, retention, advocacy. I talked about some of these things before. Community can be a way to just engage your customers in ways that you don't normally, in more kind of authentic ways. We know from, again, I've been doing this for like 25 odd years. We know from the data that all of these things can be true if you build community the right way, which is what we're going to talk about here today with strategy. So, you can make happier customers, you can keep them longer, they'll advocate for you more. There's a lot of benefits, as you can imagine, across all of those that are really interesting for people. And last but not least, and most people kind of forget about this one, which is why I like to bring it up, is we get so focused on the customer experience, which we should, because it's the most important thing. But one thing that often gets left behind, people don't think of with community, is that it's inherently a collaborative, strategic thing to do in your company. And so what that typically means is one person generally isn't going to do 100% of the work and maintenance and driving community. They're going to need help, right, from other people around the business. And so, ironically, a lot of people bring me in to like, hey, help us build a community. And yeah, we'll do that. What I end up doing is actually getting them talking to each other and working together and collaborating. And so in that way, community can be like this really great forcing function to get people inside your company collaborating in ways that they didn't before, which I think is just a fantastic outcome, for any business. So really important one that we don't often talk about there.
Awesome. And there was actually a question that came in. So I'm going to pop this up on stage here from Kyle. So what factors should you consider when deciding between focusing on an owned or rented community program? When's the right time to shift to an owned space?
I assume by rented, Kyle might mean, subreddits or some like, other industry Discord or, Slack channel or something. I'll talk about this a little bit later, but the answer to the question is the eye is sort of in the beholder there. I don't know that there's an exact right time that I could give you. It's more about, hey, let's do some experiments maybe in those off domain or rented areas, as you might call them. And see if it resonates with people, see what kind of audience is there, see if they're hungry for more community, right? And I think once you've satisfied your need to kind of understand, like there is a decent sized audience and they have some needs that are being unfulfilled, and we think we can do that, then that might be a time for you to sort of say, hey, like, let's go build our own thing and try to bring people over to those domains. With all of that said, I actually think you should do both of those things always, right? So you should have your owned on domain, community, whatever that looks like, and you should participate in places elsewhere, right? I don't think it's a zero-sum game. It's not an A versus B. It's actually probably an all of the above, type of strategy works best.
Fantastic. Yeah.
All right. Very cool. So I always like to show this slide. If you followed me anywhere before, you've seen this before, but I like to talk about, community as a vehicle to drive value across the entire customer journey. This, of course, is not the entire customer journey, but it's a pretty good subsection of it. It's obviously not always linear like this either, but you kind of get the idea here that if you do community correctly and you think about what are all the touch points, right? Where are all the different places that we talk to customers or we connect with them or they find us or they're trying to solve a problem or do something? And we start to think about, okay, how can we leverage what we're building in community to solve some of these problems? You're probably not going to solve all of these, certainly not all right at once, right? But you could start to tackle one of these and then tackle another one. And then, in a few years, you come back to a slide like this and it's like, hey, we're actually doing most of these things pretty well, right? And so you kind of get a sense of throughout Amy's journey here, how we might sort of impact her journey and help her out and leverage community across these different things. And then as you also see, you get value as well, right? So there's a lot of stuff. I'm not going to go through this whole thing. This is a great one to take a screenshot of or get the slides after, which I'll give you the link to do. But it's a good example of, if we actually turn our focus to helping customers succeed and giving them what they need, then we will also get some business value out of it. And you can kind of see how those are mapped there. Okay, so I've said a lot. We're about 20 minutes in here. Let's talk about how to actually do that. So you kind of know how to frame it. You kind of know the goal of like, okay, how are we going to do this? But how do you start to build a strategy, right? Now, this is how I build strategy. I'm sure there's a bunch of different ways. I'm sure other people do it however they do it. That's totally fine. listen, take what's good, leave the rest, you do you. But this has worked really well for me over the years. I've probably helped like 200 plus companies do this. So it is rooted in some, key learnings and that sort of thing. So we'll start kind of high level and then I'll break each one down. First and foremost, community is about people, right? So it's about the people that we're trying to attract. It's about the people that come and become our super users. It's about us internally at a company and how we orchestrate, as I was saying before, with collaboration and all of that. Fundamentally, communities are about people. And so that's sort of the first pillar of how I think about strategy, which is, okay, let's figure out who's coming here, what they need, all this kind of stuff. And I'll dig deeper into that in each of these in a minute. The second one is content. I always say content is queen. Sometimes you might have heard, people say, come for the content, stay for the community. That's absolutely true. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. The third one is programs, meaning what are all of the things we're doing on this platform, right? What kind of events are we running? What kind of experiences are we building? I'll give you some examples of some of those in a minute. Fourth is technology. Now, most people have this in the number one position, right? We all want to go out. We want to buy platforms. We want to launch a community. We want to do technical stuff. We want to do integrations, all that. There's a reason why it's kind of further down the list here, because I want you to think about people, content, and programs before we start thinking about platforms and technology and that sort of stuff. A lot of people kind of do that backwards, and it really shows in both their strategy and then in sort of the delivery of the community itself. And last, but certainly not least, very connected to technology, usually I kind of lump them together actually, is design. And when I say design, I don't mean just how it looks, but it's also how does it work? What's the experience? How do people navigate this stuff? So this is how I think about strategy. This is how I break it down for people. Let's kind of jump into each one of these now, and I'll talk a little bit more about how they all kind of work. So for people, number one, you have to become customer focused. I see people launch communities all the time, and they still have this inward view of the world of, what do I need and what are our goals and how are we going to get people to do this for us? And, how can I measure it? And like, those things are important. I'm not saying they're not, but what I've found is that the best communities in the world are the ones who cater to the customer first. How are we solving their problems? How are we helping them achieve their goals? And if we do that first and we do it well, I promise you, you will get the business stuff on the back end. But if you lead with yourself and you and what you need and what department you're in and I need them to do this, it's probably not going to be a very compelling experience. And I don't know too many people who want to kind of hang around in a community like that. So this is as much a cultural thing that it is anything else, right? Is helping your company understand, hey, we're going to be a little bit more open and focused on our customers to start. The second bit is we have to understand their motivations, goals, and like what outcomes they want. Everybody says they're customer focused or they care about customers. This is where you kind of find out that maybe people aren't, or they're not as much as they think they are. When you start asking about personas, right? What do we know about these people? What are they trying to do in their careers or their lives? What motivates them? What doesn't motivate them? What does success look like to them if they're going to come to this community? All of those kinds of questions that we then sort of put into, very specific personas that we design the community around. And the third part of this, which is very related, is a lot of people just guess at this. You'd be surprised. Companies spend so much time and money guessing, right? We think they want this, or we think they're going to want that, or we know better than they do. And the reality is people actually have a pretty good handle on what they like and don't like and what their needs are. And I tell people, just ask them, use surveys, have a call with them, understand. Kind of back to Kyle's point before, these are some of the things you can do before you invest and shift to like an owned community on your own domain. Go talk to these people and figure out what they want first, right? Understand if they want your on domain community before you go build it. So that's a good call out there. And then, as I said, you're going to parse these into personas. Most communities have 2 to 5. I've seen up to like 10 and 12. Those are communities that are very mature and have a huge product suite and a bunch of stuff like that. But generally speaking, you're going to have like 2 to 3 core personas. And they may be similar or have overlap with like your product or your go-to-market personas, but they may be a little bit different on the community side in terms of what are they looking for from a community perspective. So just understand it's not always the same thing as maybe what you've already done for product and whatnot. So that is people. And before I move on, I'll pause and ask if there were any other, I guess, questions that came in.
No questions as of right now yet.
Okay. Let's talk about content. As I said before, people come for the content and they stay for the community. A lot of people miss this or don't fundamentally understand that the core driver of like, why do people show up at a community in the first place, right? It's not usually, and I say not usually, sometimes it is, but not usually like, oh, I'm seeking belonging and connection and feelings and that sort of stuff. Maybe some communities are that way, but the vast majority of communities, it's like I came here to solve a problem first, and then I solved my problem. And as I was solving it, maybe I clicked around or I saw recommended content or there was an onboarding flow that I went through that introduced me to other stuff in the community. So this is kind of common. You need to understand this, and that community is a numbers game, as I like to say, meaning, it's all about fractions of fractions and percentages. And there's kind of a funnel type of a situation of how people come in and engage in community. And so what you need to understand is that first and foremost, you need to build great content. You need to build things that are going to help people solve their problems. Back to those personas, right? What are the problems they have? How do we solve them? And then you might be able to capture them and have them stay for more of the community activities. So content is just crazy, crazy important. I can't stress it enough. If it weren't for people, content would definitely be number one. I think this is the big thing that most people need to focus on and build programs around, and then they'll build a much more successful community. It's a bit ironic, I guess, in that case, because you think, well, wait, we're building community. What are you talking about? Content. But that's sort of the nature of how this works. Number two, you probably have some people in your company with a ton of subject matter knowledge, expertise, but it's locked in their head, right? Maybe you have a support team that has a huge, like they have Salesforce or Zendesk or, any of these support ticketing systems, but all that knowledge is locked in there, right? How do I Google that? How do I get access to it? So one thing you need to think about is like, how do I get all of this knowledge out of these systems, out of people's heads, and into a community where people can self-serve? Again, back to the efficiency and the scale, right? Stop answering questions one-to-one, answer them one time in community, and then have people self-serve on that same answer for the rest of time. This is where the cost part comes in. And, from a support perspective, at least, whatever costs you $80, $100 to solve in your traditional support channels probably costs you pennies. And those pennies only get smaller in fractions of those pennies as more people self-serve on it. So there's a big advantage cost-wise there. It's not set it and forget it. You can't just like do a big blast of content in the beginning and say, we did it, we're done, we're out of here, peace. You actually have to continue doing that as a long-term program, building more content and more content and more content. So understand that it's a long game. And if you want to keep community vibrant, you also have to keep your content program vibrant as well. So how do we start though? Like this probably feels kind of daunting, especially if you're a smaller company or a founder or something. What I always tell people, the very simple answer is just start with the questions that everybody's tired of answering internally, right? Go talk to your customer facing teams and say, what are the top 5 questions? What are the top 10 questions we get asked all the time that we're so sick of answering or copying and pasting into the reply? Those are great candidates, right? To start your content program on and say, okay, can we build 10 knowledge articles, or can we seed those questions in community and answer them so that they're answered there? Start with the basic stuff and then, figure it out from there. But most companies I find don't actually have a problem with the volume of content they have access to. It's usually the reverse. It's usually, hey, we have a ton of content. Every group in the company is building all kinds of stuff. We've just never organized it, right? We've never put it into some sort of program and tried to channel it somewhere. So that may or may not be the case at your company, but I think if you start digging around, you probably find there's more than you think. And you can start small and then kind of scale it from there.
Yeah, love that. There was actually another question that came in. It says, what are some common mistakes you've seen folks make when planning and developing content for their communities? Because I feel like this is, I was talking to Mark, and we have this whole people first content and some other stuff launching and like, putting out exclusive content. So it's definitely validating our thought there. But what are some of those common mistakes that you're seeing?
I'd go back to the focus, right, of the content, meaning a lot of times when people start their content program, they're like, what are our goals? What should we document? That sort of thing. And it's really, again, number one, it's about like, what do these customers actually need from their perspective? I think that's important. And then just not having enough of it, honestly. No one ever showed up to a community and said, boy, I wish there was less content here, right? They might say, I wish I could search it better. I wish I could navigate it. I wish I could find what I'm looking for. That's a little bit of a different problem, perhaps. But no one is like, oh, I wish there was less answers. There's almost too much help here, So I think that's the biggest thing, is kind of being relentless about it and saying, okay, what can we build that's going to like be useful and helpful to people? And if we do that pretty consistently over a long period of time, a bunch of little ones makes a big one, right? And we're going to end up with a, very large quantity of, content and knowledge and discussions and video recordings from events and like all these different things, right, that we're doing that produce content. So I would say just not being aggressive enough would be, kind of a common error there.
That's fantastic. Thank you.
Oftentimes, I'll just follow up with one thing and then we'll move on, is that people say, oh my God, I didn't realize that this was so important. And I don't know if we have time for this, like it seems like a lot of work. We don't have enough people in the company to do it. And it's like, then you're just kind of not going to have a great community, right? I don't know what to tell people other than like, this is part of the investment, right? And you need to kind of wrap your head around that and accept it, that, you're not going to just put up a community and people are going to show up and it's going to be amazing. Just like anything else, any other kind of program that we would do or go to market thing that we would do at a company, this is just one of the requirements to have a successful and ongoing and vibrant community. Over time, what you hope is that the folks there are building more of the content than you are, right? And so it becomes more scalable. You're doing kind of less of the overall work. That's the goal. But up front, you're definitely going to have to invest in, this aspect of it until you reach that point of critical mass where your customers and partners and employees are in there talking to each other and just generating content, right? So just kind of understand that that's a core bit. Programs. What do I mean by programs? Basically anything that's built on top of the community platform, right? So if you think of the community as a platform, the question becomes, okay, well, what are we doing there, right? Content is one of them, but some of the others we'll talk about. I tend to break down kind of the flow of community into acquisition, conversion, onboarding, engagement, and then like long-term retention. Okay. So we'll talk about each one of those. So when we think about programs, acquisition is kind of it's a program, right? What's our acquisition program for community? Well, we're putting a link on our .com. We're doing things to make sure that our community content shows up in Google. We're sending email notifications or newsletters, right? If we're a software product, for example, maybe we have a link to community in the help menu, or maybe when people search, community results are there. That's like the in-app part of it. What are we doing at our conference? Are we talking about community? Are we telling people it exists? All of these different ways of figuring out how do we get people to know about the community and then come to it. And this is a big mistake. So, kind of on the theme of like, what mistakes do people make? This is a big one. People like launch a community and they're like, where is everybody? Right? And you kind of ask, well, what kind of acquisition have you done? What kind of promotion of the community have you done? And they're like, oh, well, we just put a link on the website and that was it. And we're shocked that nobody showed up to this thing. And it's like, if people don't know about it, they're not going to visit, right? So having a set of programs around acquisition, how do we get people to know it exists and to come here, right? Is really, really important. And you can imagine what all of those are, because most people are doing this in other ways for other things. Conversion kind of becomes about the call to action side of it. So once people come to your community, they land on it and it's like, okay, great, I'm here. How do we entice them to become members, right? There's usually a set of programs around this where we build certain calls to action. We gate certain content, right, behind permissions where we say, hey, if you want to see this, you have to sign in, you have to sign up, right? That's particularly effective, although I want you to balance that out, because you put too much behind, then people don't know it exists either. So there's a little bit of a balance. But ultimately, it's just showing them the value of like, here's what members get. Here's the benefit of being a member, and here's what other people are getting as benefits of being a member. So you have a set of programs around conversion and getting them to become an active member, right? What about onboarding? They sign up, and then what? We just dump them back into the community and say, good luck, right? Well, there's a set of programs around onboarding. How do we welcome them to this community? How do we help them understand how to use it? Do we put them in some sort of drip campaign where for the next 6 weeks, we're sending them, hey, did you see this article in community? Seems like it's relevant to your interests, And then, of course, gamification, right? Like, how do I earn badges and ranks and, enter into a contest to get a shirt and a hat or a mug, all these different things, right? You can imagine the programs around that. And then last, but certainly not least, and again, everybody usually skips here and skips the first three, which is why I put it at the end, is the engagement side of it. Okay, you've got these people here, they're members, they're properly onboarded. Now what? Well, we want them to engage kind of on a more long-term way, and we want to retain them as a member through that engagement. Okay, what kind of programs are we going to build? Well, maybe they're answering questions, right? Depending on your type of community, they're doing Q&A. Maybe we have ongoing contests. Maybe we do regular challenges. We have events, virtual and in person, like we're doing here, right? You have even more gamification that is geared towards, engagement, retention programs. Maybe if you have top users, you build a program around them that's kind of a formal program to reward them, right? There's so much more. I could spend hours and hours and hours talking about programs, right? But this is sort of the way to think about it and the types of things that fit in each bucket that you're going to want to build on top of. Now, again, do you have to do all of these all at once? Of course not. There's actually no real way to do that. But you need to kind of think about it in this format. And as we get to measurement, you start to look at it this way too, where it's like, okay, where are we falling down? Maybe we're doing a good job of getting people to the community, but we're not converting them, right? Or maybe we are converting them. We do a great job of that, but then we don't onboard them and we get low engagement, right? So there's sort of a linear effect here where most communities are saying, oh, we don't have enough engagement. We have an engagement problem. And then I go look at the data in this type of a format. And what you realize is, no, you actually have an onboarding problem, or you actually have an acquisition problem, right? And so you want to build programs to sort of make sure you're keeping people flowing properly through here.
Love that. There was actually another question that came in around like some of the common assumptions people make when planning their community strategy and program that's like false or otherwise.
Yeah, I think trying to think of what those would be. Typically it's like not enough investment, right? People don't realize that this is an investment like anything else. You see that a lot around community actually, where it's sort of like, can't we just stand up a, insert name of platform here and like just be done, and we'll like get someone from the company to spend 3 hours a week on it as part of their like, it's a fraction of fractions of their hours, and it's going to be great, right? And when you think about any other really important thing that you do at a company, you'd never do that, right? If I said, hey, we're going to launch this event series and I want you to do 6 events across the world in the next year. If I said to you, yeah, we'll give you $10,000 and half of one employee's time, you'd be like, you're crazy, right? We can't do a 10 event global series for 10K and half of someone's time. Community is no different, right? And so that's a common mistake, is sort of underestimating the overall investment or, like what the needs are to do it. I think too, there's just a lot of misinformation kind of about communities and how they work. On one hand, like during the COVID times when everybody was locked up, community became this really valuable, important like conversation. And on one hand, it was great that all of a sudden it came to the forefront. People wanted to know about it and that sort of thing. But you also just had like a bunch of people talking about it that frankly didn't understand community kind of to the level that all of you do now, seeing stuff like this. And so, I think you have to kind of weed through all of that and realize like what's actually a good strategy or not, which is why we're doing this. So hopefully we help you kind of cut through some of the noise there.
Yeah, fantastic advice. Thank you.
Let's talk about tech. Like I said, everybody always skips to this one. Everybody wants to, I'll just buy a platform and like community is going to happen, right? Not really, right? You have to do all these other things really well. The platform on which you reside is very important, but it's not the whole ball game, right? I've seen very, very skilled community professionals build wonderful communities on like the crappiest tech of all time, and vice versa, right? Some people go out and they spend literally hundreds of thousands of dollars on like the Ferraris of community platforms, and then it sucks. And it's like everybody loves to blame the vendor, right? In that scenario, it's like, oh, well, community didn't work and the vendor didn't help us and whatever. And like what I just want to say as kind of a hot take here is that 99.99999% of the time when I show up in a company and we're blaming the vendor, right, for why community isn't working, I take a look at people's strategy and you kind of find out that it's typically more an execution or a strategic problem than it is the platform. That said, it's important. So let's talk about it. Kyle actually preempted this one before, right? So what I wanted to say is you can build and you should build kind of both on domain and off domain, right? And that could be subreddits, Stack Overflow, Twitter in some cases, all kinds of different GitHub's a popular one where people are kind of building community in different ways. So there's a lot of like off domain stuff that you can do. But I think you also want to explore, how do we build our own community that we own, that's not subject to the like policy changes and whims of, frankly, like billionaires and people who have different goals than you do for your community. We see that time and time again, right? Like everybody's like, oh, I'm going to go build my community on insert name of social media platform here. And then overnight they like, well, we're going to change completely the policies or the APIs or like whatever. And these people's communities get destroyed like overnight, right? So there is some balance of like the convenience of doing that, the cost of doing that relative to owning your own. But you can see why it's attractive that in the end, a lot of people end up swinging back to like, I kind of want to own my own just because there's a lot of brand value in doing that too. But you want to consider both. There's a bunch of stuff that goes around this, right? You don't just necessarily buy a community platform and say, cool, we're done. Typically, you have to, how are these people authenticating, right? Do we have an IDP, an SSO? How are they connecting into it? How are people signing up? The other integration types that you can imagine, like how do we integrate this with Salesforce for our CRM or HubSpot or, whatever it is you're using? What about support systems like Zendesk and, those kinds of things? Think about like all of the other tech that goes around it, right? And understand kind of that whole pie. Sometimes I call these appliances like federated search, SSO or IDPs sometimes are also kind of an appliance. These days, there's all these other platforms. There's like Common Room and Talkbase and Orbit and stuff like that, where they're really focused on like community data and automation. So that's another thing you could go buy and plug into this. A lot of people do Zapier, right? They get Zaps and they plug those into community to automate certain things. So it's not just the one platform itself, especially if you're doing both on and off domain. Some of these like data and automation platforms are great because you can plug all of them in and then get a picture of your community across many different things, right? So that sort of brings you to the last piece here, which is, what's sort of how are we getting data? How are we analyzing this stuff? How do we know if what we're doing is working or not? Some of those will be community specific. Some of those will be things like Google Analytics, if you want to plug that into your community. How are you going to build dashboards and reporting? You don't got to do all this stuff, right? Especially not up front, but it is nice along the way. And we'll talk a little bit about measurement here more in a few minutes.
Cool. There was actually two more questions that came in. One was around, do you have any gamification software, Rex?
So most community platforms have some semblance of gamification built in, usually in the form of ranks, reputation, badges, leaderboards, that kind of basic stuff that you're going to find. Those will get you pretty far, typically, depending on what you're trying to build. But if you're looking at gamification more holistically across not just like your on-domain community, but what about events? What about like advocacy things that they're doing, right? Different activities. That's when you may go look at something a little bit more comprehensive. I wouldn't say that there's like one platform I could name and say like, just go buy that and you're going to be good. Kind of like we're talking about here, there's like a universe of them, right? You might go get Credly, for example, for like certifications and, badges and stuff. And you might go get a different platform for like missions and other things. Influitive is one of those, although it's geared more towards like advocacy. So there's a whole bunch of those, and it really comes down to like, what's your strategy, right? And like, what do you need to successfully execute that?
Fantastic. And then the other one is, in your experience, what have you found as one of the greatest obstacles faced by B2B community initiatives?
Usually internal company culture. It's not the tech. It's not the content. It's not, it's usually like, are you ready as a company to become customer centric is the first thing. It's a philosophical thing that a lot of companies, again, if you listen to any CEO, at any company in the world, on any call they do, or, talk they do at their conference or whatever, everybody's going to say, oh, we love our customers, right? We're customer focused. We're all about the customer. But like, look at their behavior, right? Look at their actions. And I think sometimes you'll find that what comes out of their mouth and what they actually do are kind of two different things. And I understand why, right? Because becoming truly customer and community focused is hard, right? If it was easy, everybody would do it. And that's what, like, when I talked about building a moat before, that's kind of the difference, right? If I have 5 companies, we're all doing the same thing. We all kind of have a similar product or service. Like, if I do the hard work at my company to become customer focused, community centric, build a great community, really focus on helping people achieve their dreams and goals, then all of a sudden, I'm leaps and bounds ahead of the other 4 guys, right? So I think that's probably the biggest obstacle, is like, are people ready for that philosophically? And then the last piece, which is kind of true across anything at any company, is, are people willing to collaborate on it, right? Because a lot of companies, again, oh yeah, we love working together and we're a collaborative company, blah, blah, blah. I think we all know, we've all worked at companies that you show up in some places and it's like, none of these people know each other. They're all working in silos. They don't want to work together. They're actually combative. That's a hard place to build a great community.
Fantastic. Thank you.
Last and certainly not least, and then we'll get to some other stuff and answer more questions, although I love the questions coming in. This is great. Let's talk about design, right? It's how it looks and how it works. Everybody thinks just the first part, right? Let's make it beautiful. Let's get marketing in here and design whatever. And it's like, no. It's like, what is the information architecture underneath all of this, right? What structure have we built for the content and the discussions and the events? How do people navigate that, right? What does the navigation look like? Where's the search? Like, how do we position all of this stuff? I could talk about this one for days and days and days and days. There's so many different facets of it, but it's both how it looks and how it works. And ultimately, what I would just say here is, like, I'm a golden rule guy, meaning like, I never want to build something that I myself would not want to use or am not proud of. And I think this second part here, the how it works, we kind of fail that regularly in things that we do, where we build stuff and we're like, I don't really like it, but anyway, ship it to our customers, right? I think you want to spend some time, especially in community, because trust and authenticity is so important, really making sure you nail the experience part of it. So again, architecture, structure, navigation, discovery, like all of these things are part and parcel of the design itself. Some of that's how those look, but a lot of it's how they, where are they positioned? How do they work? Is it feeding the right information at the right time? Is it, helping me as a consumer or a member of this community find stuff? And then you can go look at, okay, what's the visuals? What's the UI and UX? Is it beautiful? Do we have, all of our badges with our colors and our fonts, and we've uploaded our custom font into the community platform and blah, blah, blah. Like all those different things. It's super important. I'm not saying it's not. I just want people to understand there's a balance here. And what I often see is people way over index towards the looks part of it. And then they wonder why, again, back to those programs we talked about, right? They wonder why, like, how come people aren't staying around? And how come they're having a hard time finding what they're looking for? And it's like, because we designed a beautiful website and not a community experience, which are two very different things, right? So there's got to be a balance of this. And what I would say is that in most communities, utility is actually more important than beauty. You want to have a little bit of both, right? But I was at a conference years ago. I always tell this story, so forgive me if you've followed me and you've heard this before, but I think it's a useful thing. Is years ago I was at a conference and I was showing a screenshot of a really a community that I was proud of that we designed. And it was pretty heavily like the front page of the community was kind of a lot of dense links and navigation and whatever. Some guy raised his hand and said, man, it's just a list of links. And I said, yeah, so is Google. Right. And so I think as much as we want to make this stuff beautiful, you realize the things that people use every day and get a lot of value out of are a little bit more utilitarian than you would think. And I think Google is like the ultimate example of it's literally a list of blue links. Right. So there's that. Last but not least, are we efficiently driving members to specific outcomes? So we'll talk about measurement here in a minute. But if you think back to the goals and the programs and all that stuff, it's like, what do we actually want them to do? Or what do they want to do? And are we using the way that we've designed this to properly drive them in that direction? So that's really what design is about at the end of the day and what we want to do as community builders. Okay, I know we just have a few minutes left here, and then we'll leave some time for Q&A. Let me talk about how you operationalize all this. So I just threw a lot at you, talked about a lot of different things, right? There's a lot to there's a lot in your brain probably rattling around if you've never done this before. What I always say, though, is like at the end of the day, we have to execute this stuff. Like I can talk about it. I can make pretty slides. I can tell you got to do A, B, and C and X, Y, Z, whatever. The real question is, how do we go about doing that? So I want to show you this. Looks a little overwhelming at first, but I'll sort of break it down for you. This is kind of the high-level roadmap of an operational plan, right? So typically you'd probably have a spreadsheet or something or a project plan that undergirds this with dates and names and dependencies and, risks and all that kind of stuff. But at a high level, what I want you to understand is like everything that we just talked about can be put into a format like this, where it greatly sort of simplifies it and makes it visual, where it's like, okay, we have our people, we have our content, we have our technology, and then I sort of lumped design and experience into one bucket there. But you have these tracks, and in each track, there's sort of, okay, here's the personas we're working on first. We got to build some content. We got to go get a platform and implement it, right? You can kind of follow this along. Again, I'll give you this slide at the end here. You can just go download it, take a screenshot, whatever. But you can sort of get the idea of like, just like anything else we would do, you're going to build a plan of here's the things we need to do, when we need to do them, some level of prioritization and importance, and then you roll through it, right? And of course, you have to have the people and the investment to do all these things. But just like anything else, there's got to be a plan. It can't just be pretty slides and, inspiration. I want to help you translate that into an actionable plan that you can then take and go. So does yours look like this? I have no idea, right? But whatever it is, translate your strategy into a plan and then execute it and make sure you're, kind of tracking along with all those things. All right. Last but not least, certainly not least, measurement. Let me go through a couple of frameworks. I'm going to gloss over these pretty quick. You can go download these because there's too much probably to talk about here. But what I want you to understand is how do you translate sort of strategic goals into actual measurements around your business? So if we look at a couple of examples like customer success, a lot of people these days are like, hey, why are we building community? Because we want to increase our retention rates, right? Particularly relevant in our current high interest rate environment. We need to, retain the customers we have. Okay, great. You have this business goal. What are we going to do about it? Well, our strategy is we're going to build robust learning and enablement focused content in a community somewhere, right? Okay, great. That's our strategy. There's probably 20 slides, of that strategy, but that's the boiled down version. How are we going to know that's working? Well, we're going to, as a KPI, we're going to try to understand how much of that learning and enablement focused content is actually influencing retention rates, right? And we may do that through some cohort analysis where we take data from the community and data from Salesforce or wherever our like revenue data is. And we try to understand, are people in community retained at a higher rate than those who aren't, or at a rate that's higher, or they, stick around longer, or whatever the case is, right? So it's kind of a simplistic example. You have to build all of the, mechanisms around it. But this is how you translate a business goal or outcome through community, but then understand like, okay, what kind of data do I actually need to make that happen? And what's the KPI? I'm going to build out support. This is probably the most basic one of all. We want to reduce costs. We're going to build the self-service support community. This is what like the vast majority of communities in the world are about, at least at first, before they explore other things. And so we want to measure the value of that, right? Like, if people are self-serving over there and they're not calling our support team, we're saving a bunch of money. Well, how do we know that? Well, we need to get a bunch of data and put it all together, right? So I'm kind of going over this quickly. I have entire presentations on the same page where this deck is going to be. So when I give you the link here in a minute, you'll see it. I have entire presentations, entire talks, entire everything about how to do this more. So I won't go into it too much deeper, but just to give you a sense of like, what does the framework look like? Let me build out a couple others here, and then we'll take some questions. So marketing, they're typically like, we want to do community because we want to do thought leadership. We want to like get new leads. We want to discover people we've never met before. Okay, great. Here's your content program and like education and stuff like that. And then of course they're going to try to measure, where are these coming from? Are these net new people? Did they come from community? Product is typically about ideation and adoption, right? It's like, can we source ideas from our community? Can we turn those into meaningful product updates or feature sets? All that kind of good stuff. So again, I'll kind of gloss over that and we'll get to the Ask Me Anything part. But if you go to this brianoblinger.com slides, these slides are there and you can just take them. No form fills, no BS. And then there's also all the other presentations, that I've kind of done. So you can spelunk in those as well.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much, Brian. I learned a ton. You validated a ton for me. And so I've been also building communities, mostly in B2B tech companies for about 5 or 6 years now. But I mean, it's what you talked about is at the core of a lot of the things that I'm a big believer in as well. So thank you for that. There is a few questions that came in here. Going back to that roadmap piece. So it appears quite lengthy. How pragmatic / possible is it to launch a community in 1 or 2 quarters versus a year?
Totally depends on your goals, your resources. So you're right that this is an example from like an enterprise B2B company, right? So I should have set that expectation. I apologize for not doing that when I showed this before, which is that like, this is kind of the highest level of, I'm working with a Fortune 500. We're going pretty fast and doing a lot of stuff. When you say, can I build a community in a couple of months versus quarters versus years versus whatever, the answer to all of those is yes, right? It totally depends on what your goals are, how fast you can go, what kind of resources you want. You certainly do not have to do what I'm showing here. Most communities probably start out much, much simpler than this, right? With a minimum kind of investment, and it's more of an experimental thing up front just to see if it works before we do more. So yeah, I wish I could like say, oh yeah, like it's going to be this much money in this many months and whatever, but it's so dependent on what you're trying to do strategically, right? And so you see communities at both ends of that spectrum, from like, we're going to spend a year building this thing before we ever launch it, all the way to like, I don't know, let's just throw something up and do an experiment and see if it's worthwhile, and then everything in between. So it's a very personal, personalized thing from a strategic perspective, depending on a myriad of factors at your organization.
Awesome. And then there was another one around, what's the most effective way to communicate community attributed outcomes to leadership? How do you refine simple correlation to outcomes into compelling business cases?
Yeah. If you look at the strategy and the KPIs on these types of slides, this could be a long answer. I'll try to keep it short. I think the biggest thing is converting the language of community and what you're doing to whatever language already exists in your business. Like, one of the things that we've done a little bit too much of over the years in community is tried to like press our language on people and, try to teach them about how we think about community. And I just don't think it works that well, right? I think you need to do what we're showing in these kinds of slides, where it's like, from a business perspective, if I walk into a meeting with the CEO or the executive team or whatever, and I say, hey, did you know that community is helping us retain our customers longer, or we're generating more leads through community, or our product is better because the product team's gathering feedback directly from it. Like, those are things they already understand and they talk about every day, and like goals they probably already all have. So it's really about, how do we take what we do as community builders and translate that into the language of the business we're in? And I think you just break down so many barriers by doing that. But to do that, you have to do some work. And that's what these slides are all about, right? Is like, how do you sort of put in that effort and get access to the data and do the work to have concrete things that you can say? It's hard, right? There's a reason why not everybody does it. Again, it's hard, but it'll differentiate you if you can do that. And it's going to lead to more investment and understanding in your company as a whole around community.
Fantastic. Yeah, no, completely agree with you. I know we only have like a minute or so left. So where can people go to find you? What if they want to continue that conversation with you?
Yeah, a couple things. Go check out the slides, brianeblinger.com. Of course, you can find me on LinkedIn. I post a lot of events and content and stuff there. I did want to tell you all about this too. So I recently launched the Strategy Academy, where I'm basically taking everything I've ever learned about community and dumping it into really high quality courses. They're priced really well, but I'll go ahead and give you a code here you can take and grab a course or a membership or whatever it is. You can just use Club PF there for 15% off. There's like 16 or 17 courses there today. The roadmap has over 50, so it's only going to get more valuable as time goes on, especially for people who have memberships. So if you want to learn more about this, but you're like, hey, I'd love to engage someone like Brian as a consultant, but we're just not ready for that yet. I'd rather spend $50 or $100 or whatever and go learn some of this stuff. I totally get it. Like, that's cool. Go to the academy, pop in the code. You can get in there for pretty cheap and like learn a lot pretty deeply about all this stuff.
Fantastic. Awesome. Brian, thank you so much for joining us. This was fantastic. For everyone that is still out there, make sure to go follow Brian, check out the website, use the Club PF code, and we'll catch you all next time on the next event. Have a great rest of your day, everyone.
Great. Thanks, everybody. See ya.